Hello, Jules.
Hi.
Do you hear me well?
Yes. And you?
Yeah, perfectly. So, how are you?
Fine. I'm working on the Carrefour. And you?
Ah, the famous Carrefour. Nice. I'm happy to hear about that. Me, I'm fine. It's good also to have some time at home. It's not happening so often. So, how is it going in Tirana? Have you finally been transformed into an Albanian guy?
No, not yet. I still have some work to do before getting to this state. But yes, everything is fine here. Everybody works well, I think, and I have a lot of things to discuss. The only problem here maybe is the weather. It has been a week that it's raining all the day. A really strong rain, really impressive. Even the people from here are surprised. It's not supposed to rain so much at this period of the year.
Yeah, it's hard. Let's hope that I will still be able to come in 2 weeks because of the storm. There's a lot of flights cancelled. But so, tell me a bit about this Carrefour thing.
Yes, so in fact, I began to do the same thing that I already did in Brussels with the Carrefour. I chose one in Tirana and I made some measurements of it with my body. After that, I began to do this game of trying to make a circle around the Carrefour without ever stopping. And I was really surprised when I discovered that it was possible to do so. So I began to measure the system of the traffic lights and try to understand how the circulation was working there. I also made, with all the documents I had, a video game that is working as a simulation of the Carrefour system. It's a game to train myself to be able to do the circle around the Carrefour.
Ah, yes, I remember that we spoke about that at the time. I think you did show me some of those documents, no?
Yes, I sent you some animations, videos from the policemen or images, and also the plan, some pictures of my notebook.
And also some of your protocols. I remember the visual surface of the notes that you took actually.
Yes, and also the video game I made from the walking around the Carrefour.
What I remember is the animation of the policeman in a little sort of shape moving on the big white.
There was the first observation of the Carrefour, the measurements I made. I did the same things that I did in Brussels, so all the things with the measurements, the video game I made with Paul, a friend of Judith.
And there was this interesting observation there being a fundamental difference between the Carrefour in Brussels and the one in Tirana. That traffic lights in Tirana would not sort of intelligently react, but then instead of that, the policeman will take control at a certain time, right? If the non-match between the traffic intensity and the regular system of the traffic lights regulation would be too strong, then policemen would have the actual power to take over from the lights and claim more importance in their gestures.
Yes, completely. That was the main point of the observation of the Carrefour I made after. I saw that the lights in Tirana were not the same as the ones in Brussels, so they needed policemen to help when there was too many people on the Carrefour, because the lights were not following the movement. So I wanted to understand how the policemen were doing their job and how it was working. At which time were they here? What was the movement they were making? How many were they? Etc. So I began to do this week of observation, to observe all the policemen, to film them and to draw them, to understand the movements. And I began to do a script with all the information I had for each day, with the hours when they were there, and all the elements around that were from me interacting with the policemen in a sense. And now I'm in the middle of this week. I made already 2 days of observation at the moment. I'm speaking to you, and for those 2 days, I saw different things that I found interesting. For example, the weather is important for the policemen movements. By the way, in this moment, the weather is really bad, and so there is a lot of more policemen than when there is sun. And now I'm continuing my observations.
I didn't ask you before, but I would like to ask you now. How did you find the Carrefour? How did you choose?
Well, it's a lot of different things because the first thing I thought when I came in Tirana was that there will be no possibility for me to do the same game that I was doing in Brussels. So in the beginning, I didn't even thought of choosing a Carrefour because the chaos of circulation was too strong, and for me, it seems too dangerous and too complicated to be able to do this game. And I thought that it was not a good idea. And so that's why also I made this performance of sitting. I wanted to try other things because in my mind I couldn't do the Carrefour game. But at some point, I just wanted to try to do the game on one carrefour, and this carrefour was not too far from home. That's an important characteristic. And it was also close to the center of the city, a bit in between the two things, and it was also one of the first carrefour that you could really understand. It was not one of those carrefour that were built in the periphery of the city. Here it was a bit more structured.
And also, there's a lot of carrefour indeed in Tirana where you have either cars or people, or for instance, in the periphery, there's less regularly this kind of mix that you are rather used from here. Crossings where you have passerby, bikers, cars, cafes.
Yes, that's also why I wanted to be there. It's also because there was a lot of cafe, and I remember that where we already passed a lot of time with you and the others. For example, when I met Sam, I was going to search him in the center of the city, and the meeting point was this carrefour. I also met Jordana there for the first time. It's a point where we were always trying to find ourselves in the city because the group needed some points to not be lost every day. So it was one of those points, and it was mixing a lot of things to be a good start to try to do the game. In fact, I wanted to try this carrefour because it was close to me, but it's after my first try of the game that I understood that the apparent complexity was not real. In fact, it was not even close to the complexity of Brussels, because the carrefour itself was structured as a simple and understandable technique. So it was possible to understand how it was constructed really more than the one in Brussels. That's also why the circulation was so chaotic, I think. It was because the system was not complex. It was not an intelligent structure. It was the same loop all the time and not at all interacting with the circulation.
You are talking about the rhythm of the lights.
Yes, it's one of the most important aspects that I saw in the first time because it was influencing a lot of the circulation.
It's true, and this is what impacts the presence of the policeman, obviously. It's interesting because I never noticed that Tirana traffic was actually not regulated according to the density of the traffic, but with a kind of regular system, which I guess doesn't in fact reduce complexity, but transfers it to a human being intervention.
Yes, that's one thing that you can only see if you're playing with your body, experimenting this circulation and this rhythm in a particular way of putting your body. That was the point of the game, of turning around the carrefour and never stopping.
I think there's different aspects, no? A particular kind of attention or physical intervention through your body, but also an idea of spending time and putting your physical body where you're not supposed to put and to keep it that amount of time normally.
Yes, completely. And that's why also you never really see this construction. It's because you are at the carrefour enough time to see that. For me, to understand the rhythm of the traffic lights, I had to go there every day for 2 weeks and to calculate the lights and to watch them in parallel and to see how it was working all together. And only after that, redoing this video game, I understood that it was the same loop turning again and again. But it's also a performance in a sense because I was always in an absurd posture inside this carrefour, watching the lights with my notebook during 2 weeks, counting the seconds and turning all around the place. But there is something I reflected a lot after that about the traffic lights. I made a comparison between the system in Tirana and the one in Brussels. I began a reflection about this idea that maybe the chaos of the circulation in Tirana is really strong also because the car drivers, for example, feel that the technology that is regulating them is less strong than them. And so they affirm the liberty of passing through because they feel that the carrefour is not interacting with them.
It might be that. But I mean, also Tirana is a context where all the order systems that sort of regulate daily life are relatively young, relatively unestablished. There might be an under-complexity of an order system in a certain way as what you describe, but also I think that there's something about the culture or a certain way of interaction in public space that here immediately resonates in my mind. We were talking about the way to handle the traffic situation, saying that there is a technical system that is deliberately unintelligent, so to speak. And then it's a human interaction that actually takes over at a certain point. This creates a chaos in one way, but it also creates a particular kind of proper interaction. I mean, I guess the policemen are not just giving signs, but as I know the traffic and actually more generally the communication in Tirana, it means that they rather talk to cars that drive by, and I don't know, it's interesting because It's a bit like when you look at the implementation of an address system some 10, 20 years ago there, which was so complicated at the beginning. People were used to the fact that the guy who brings the letters would not refer to the addresses and accordingly put them in a letterbox, but commonly he would go to the kiosk or local cafe and he would talk to the guy in the kiosk and show him the letters to find every addressat in the neighborhood. Those local practices were an aspect of why the all-over realization of an address system in Albania by international agencies has been so incredibly complicated. While from our perspective, there's something obvious to the abstraction of linking one person with a city, a street, a number. What I mean, there's this enormous amount of interaction that we can maybe not, or at least not only describe as an outcome of dysfunctionality of an order system, but it's actually a form of a culture that also properly contradicts a certain order system that we share in our context. It's interesting to think about that, I think. What it creates in terms of performance or concretely the way the policemen on the Carrefour are actually interacting with the people.
Yes, and I was thinking about that. The presence of the policemen is really changing all the circulation rhythm because they are watching what is happening in the circulation. What are the problems with the different flux? And that's what is really surprising. The lights are still working, but nobody cares about them.
Yes, this would never ever work in another country in Europe, right?
Yes, completely.
Imagine this would happen in Germany, in Belgium, or in France. If the lights were running, we would always give the priority to them, ever before to the person who's evidently and actually regulating the traffic, right?
Right. But it is also because the system of regulation in Brussels, for example, is so well done. People are used to it so much that they don't see it. We don't have a clear conscience of it anymore.
I mean, there's a sort of Foucault-like observation, that there is a form of abstraction somehow that makes us believe in a justified way to deal with the situation, right? Or we cannot really negotiate a form of subjectivity of this because we believe, it's okay, it's a technical system that is kind of intelligent but rational. It lacks the subjectivity of policemen who might just prefer, I don't know, a certain kind of car or being sympathetic or antipathetic with the person who's driving there. I don't know. I think there's really a contradiction of different kinds of order systems. Not just more developed or less developed. I mean, this is the way we tend to see it because we have a very particular logic or systematic in mind. As we say, system, we are trained to it. It's interesting because the tension that it creates, that the traffic lights might not be absolute power and therefore a driving process, it might create an attention that in turn could even reduce the amount of accidents. I remember that Harry Collins in his Tacit and Explicit Knowledge was stating an argument in relation to that. Let me think. Defining his notion of tacit knowledge, this division between explicit and tacit knowledge, the one that you can put into words, and on the other hand, a knowledge that is more like a how-to-do sort of knowledge, basically not reducible to verbal concepts. So he was saying that the classical definition of tacit knowledge, the how-to-do knowledge, is, for example, riding a bike. This is, I think, also how the inventor of the term Polanyi puts it in the 50s. He says that you could talk forever to a person, but this person would never learn how to ride a bike if this person is not actually training, which is practicing to ride a bike. Because what you do, but Collins came later and said, yes, but we are not sure an absolute distinction is possible like that. It might be that if you put enough rules, talk a whole life, a thing like riding a bike might still be possible to learn, just through language. The real structurally impossible, on the contrary, is a social knowledge that you cannot learn just through language. Which, to stay with the example, is not just riding a bike, but riding a bike in China, for example. And it is exactly this kind of thing that we are discussing right now. That is something that is so complex, and I think it is particularly in this regard that I find it very interesting how you invest properly your own body in the research situation. We can say that we are not able to intellectually understand how a situation in Tirana functions, right? We are foreigners. We cannot learn fast and deep enough. But by investing our body in the situation, on the other hand, we can have a kind of very simple phenomenological approach. How do you spend time and space there? Your body builds a form of resistance to the space, and this sort of crystallizes like a catalyst, a form of knowledge that is very basic through though over complex. Could we call it a way of understanding a context? Namely by keeping the distance, by keeping the foreignness of the physicality?
That was also the idea I had when I went to draw and to film the policeman. It's really about language and body. And the absurd idea I had, but in a conscious way, was to try to define the language of the policemen without asking them, just by observing and reworking on this and try to define some words with the body. That was the first idea because I wanted to understand how the policemen were replacing the traffic lights. But it's not possible to really feel the instinctive way people interact with the policemen and how the policemen are also interacting with the traffic lights, the carrefour and the people. Because there is something very simple in the gesture but also very instinctive that cannot really be compared to a language structure. You cannot define an alphabet of the policeman gestures.
It points in that sense to the non-simpleness of such simple thing. Because the policemen who are acting out certain movements that are also transferred to them, it is not only their performance, so to speak. It's a sign system that, or its basis at least, has been passed to them. But then, of course, how do they perform it? If they actually perform it, it becomes their performance, right? Because they physically enact it, and it relates very much to their bodies, to each of their body, and to the individual context also. In this moment, what we see becomes immediately over complex, unhandleable, and in fact something that is no longer readable. Now, this is very interesting. This idea of, yes, of you observing this. You extract again a sign, but not from the original source, which evidently could not even be kept as a concept here. You take it actually from the body of the policeman, more precisely from your observation of it. And it is this sign that gets reactualized through an interpretation again by other people.
Yes, that's really the way to understand more efficiently the language that they are using. Because when I was there, at some point, I asked one of the policemen to explain me what was the meaning of their language and how they were learning it. And he said that every policeman is learning the language by himself in watching the others. It's a kind of oral language transfer.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know. So how do they do that? I mean, you have a training session where one is enacting the movement and the others are doing it as well, a choreography session kind of?
In fact, I don't really know. I think they also have explanations a lot in class. But for the language learning itself, I think there is always two policemen in the carrefour, one with no experience and one who is more experienced.
That would be beautiful to see this system over time, actually. Like, if you would come in 10 years again, probably the sign of the movement system would have deliberately changed through this oral sort of transmission.
Yes, and the funny thing is also that between one policeman and one another, it's sometimes a bit different. And you can really feel that when you are trying to learn those movements with other people. All the performers who are trying to redo the gestures have different ways to understand the meaning of the language. And it's really interesting to see this development. That's why also I wanted to have it learned one by one. We just had one collective session with the policemen at the end, just before the confinement. But during 6 months before, they learned all the movements themselves, without seeing that what the others were doing. And we were really happy to see that policemen were very different at the end. There was different characters, different gestures coming out of this.
Coming back to the talk at the time, when we had this Skype session that we are now reenacting the first time, I think we intensely discussed this question of investing your physical body in the situation to be this sort of foreign body that spends time in one place for such a long time. Again, a place that is not supposed to be done for spending a week there, basically. Another aspect is that beside having an impact on the body and its communication itself, it also creates reaction in the context, right? You're not just an abstract point of observation, far from that, particularly in your foreign clumsiness. But you are a body in the space that heavily influences the functioning of the place itself. So one thing I remember we talked about was also the reaction of the policeman on your observations of what kind of strategies you would find to not be seen while you were watching. And how to even use those hiding postures, you know? Basically the feedback influence you have on the context.
But this discussion was a bit later, because when I spoke first about that during this week of the Carrefour observation, I was not yet, because it was only after this week I began to do some filatures.
You mean you were later following the people?
Yes, following, and at this moment I began also to try to recognize the policemen in all the city. You remember this little game to try to remember the faces of the policemen and to see where they were. But during this week, it was not yet the moment when they began to really interact with me. And after, when they saw me in different places, watching them always with my camera and in the same clothes, it began to be a bit more complicated, but a bit more interesting also, because they recognized me and I had to find strategies to not be recognized. To change my clothes every 1 hour, try to watch them without being seen. But in this moment of the Skype, it was yet more simple, because there were so many people that I could really be there, film them, and nobody would really know. But I think what I spoke to you about at this time, it was rather this thing to always go out to the cafe to film them, and how it changed a lot the situation in the cafe itself. People were watching me in a different way, interacting with me really more. So that was changing the situation. But it's important too, because now in the performance, I want that there is a lot of things happening in the cafe. This thing of the cafe and the change of interaction with people, it changed also a lot of the way I was watching the Carrefour, and it had an impact also a lot on the way that I made the script that I want to reenact now.
Yes, I mean, it points to a very general observation, but, well, general but relevant nevertheless, one that I think has a heavy influence on your script. The primary script that you took was traced also the fact that actually one cannot observe and record in the very same time properly. So it's a bit like either you are in a physical body observer position or you are in the position of recording, tracing, writing, and avoiding the reflecting and thus sort of distancing that very situation. So I guess you can sort of create tools or protocols to oscillate very fast between the two, but I think it is kind of structurally impossible to perform both in the same time. Another point is, I mean, this is something else that we spoke about during this Skype. Now I remembered when you mentioned this cafe interaction and the fact that you stepped out of the general crowd in the cafe because you followed this protocol of repetitive recording and stuff. Yeah. I remember I told you at this point that first time about the research of a friend, Lars Freres, about the sociologist observing ticket machines and the interactions of people with them in train stations. His practice quite relates to your approach somehow, though from a completely different perspective, as he focused the general aspect of a relation of action, perception, space, construction in those stations. For example, how what he calls an envelope of the person changes by passing the entrance, and so on. And at the end, while he originally had wanted to write a book about the train station, indeed he wrote a book about the methodology of how to observe a train station, and in fact being able and unable to do so. It's actually more a book about his own position and imposition, and how this position actually becomes one of the main motors of the situation itself, somehow.
But that's funny, because I think it's really what you feel when you are trying to do something about observing. that if you want to be sincere, you always end up by writing about your own observation, because you feel that you cannot say anything else that would be true or that would be sincere in that position.
Yes, and it's evident that somehow with your system of the body as a measure instrument in the space and by the logic of your particular attention, there's a question of a kind of radical subjectivity. So yes, I think it makes sense. And I think it's interesting as, what does all this mean? What does it produce? Does it end up by becoming exclusively such a strong form of subjectivity, even some kind of masturbation? In a sense that at the end you kind of abuse the Carrefour to talk about yourself, or do you abuse yourself to talk about the Carrefour? Well, there's something here. Like, this brings us back to the general point of what actual way do you perform in or interact with such a context. Here we go. You are this person coming to the Carrefour, and first of all you understand a general order system. But also you understand nothing. For example, because you don't know the systematic of it, and or you can even less read the reaction of the policeman than any random person who is more close to the context somehow, for example, speaking Albanian. Well, according to the previous discussion, this is a question, actually. Anyway, I think it's interesting to see this also as a reaction, to test the hypothesis, yes, but then maybe this sort of phenomenology of the body, of one's own attention system, might maybe, to be honest, it might be the only way to enter a context. Finally, what does it mean to be from a context? For example, if you go on the street right in front of your apartment, or to the kiosk around the corner in comparison, do you then share the same context with what is happening in those places? Well, obviously not, right?
Yes, it's completely that. And in the context of Tirana and the Albanian story, those aspects made me think a lot about the spying attitude. I was seeing some similarities between my observer position and the spying history of the dictatorship.
Yes. Have we been together at the Museum of Observation, the museum that was documenting all the spying activity in the Hoxha period? We discussed it quite a lot, I remember. For example, in relation to the nowadays ethnographical interest into the German Stasi archives, right? But it was actually more in relation to your activities of sitting.
No, I didn't see it with you. I saw it with my mom and my sister just after the week of observation, but I was already thinking about the spying thing because when you saw the museum with Judith and Sam, I was sitting.
Ah, yes, that was the reason why you couldn't come at the time.
Yes, and so you spoke a lot about it with me, but I actually saw it after.
It was something present in our discussion, but it's true that we didn't connect your research immediately with this idea. It is strange, actually, that we didn't relate it directly with this situation of you doing the observation at the Carrefour. No, I also remember the subject only really came up during that week somehow. And I think it was actually in that Skype where we started to discuss it a bit, no? How is this sort of involvement of the body as a system of a pseudo-objective measuring of your environment, how is this linked with the notion of the spy, of the omnipresence of observation? Not necessarily as a political instrument or as a tool of oppression, which obviously also has been a strong reality in Albania, but then also as a source of ethnographical or anthropological knowledge. The spy, with its randomness of focus that doesn't primarily distinct between what is relevant or what is not relevant, because the political spy simply doesn't know how but might be made responsible for missing something important later, leading to first of all an extreme subjectivity of observation. This has the potential to provide a major potential source of a kind of anthropological data. How does this relate to your position as a foreigner on the Carrefour? As such, would you produce an equivalent type of anthropological framing through the subjectivity of your body?
Yes, completely. And I think we already spoke a bit about the different attitudes all the group had during the trip. The attitude of Sam or Judith inside the country and the different ways to interact with people and the culture of Albania. And this attitude of observing and trying to not interact with anything, to have a sensation that would really be more connected with the culture, the reality of life there, but with a strange absurdity also because it's not possible. There is the fact that anyway, I'm always interacting as an observer with the things that I'm seeing. Because in the first place, all the observations I'm writing down are from my point of view. So departing from my subjectivity. It's a simple idea, but I think those different attitudes we had were linked to that question of how to enter a country.
What you're saying is also relevant in relation to what is happening now. How are you in place and not in place at the same time? Because all your project was, since the beginning, experimenting and observation as realization of a physical space, of a physical place, and quickly later also the reconstruction and the reenactment of such a physical public place. But most importantly, with that physical place is this is fundamentally absent in your practice. So in the same time, your process was also rendering visible this disconnection of a physical place, you being like an avatar in the situation. It's quite interesting to think about this particular form of alienation, especially in the current situation, about the impossibility of being in a public place. Then in another quite concrete way now with the COVID-19 crisis. And how within a 3D reconstruction, finally, the involvement of people who are acting and reenacting such public place isolated in their own living or bedrooms becomes paradigmatic, right? To integrate that again in the 3D model. It seems quite crazy, like an outside projection of this inside position that you performed at the time, and that we are all facing now in the forced and practically complete absence of a physical interaction that would possibly constitute a public.
Yes, it's completely linked, and it's interesting because of this fact to be at home. Like, everyone is a stranger now, and you cannot really feel the Carrefour by being there. People interact all from their room. And so I think it's a completely different way to see what will happen in a 3D live session. Also because people will have no control of what is happening, and me, I will have all the control. That was not the case when I was trying to do it in a live performance. The idea was to put people inside and to see what did I miss. And this would have interacted differently because there would have been new people and new situations that I would have been able to see. But now with the 3D thing, we have an obligation to speak about other things. It's not about what did I miss because I will control everything. And there will be nothing happening that I will not already know, except for the technical new possibilities. There will be nobody coming from their place, putting themselves in the 3D view. It's not speaking about the same thing. Because people are sitting at their place, like me when I was watching, trying to be outside of the context itself. It's a bit like me when I was at the cafe, trying to be on my computer, writing everything, like if I was not there.
And thinking the other way around, it might be that this activity or the violence of this sort of spying, a gesture of spying frame that you put somehow, it might be that this is one of the only possibilities left for us now, as a way to construct something like a public form of sharing. There's something cynical about saying this, but in another sense it isn't actually.
Yes, and now it's all about intimacy. Everything will happen in intimacy. The policemen are performing in their bedrooms or their living rooms. So the videos we have are policemen framed in an intimate place with no cars, no external sound. Actually, it's quite beautiful. I will send you some videos, but even for me, I'm doing all the characters alone in my room and on a green screen. It's really different. I'm not at all screaming, even if I have to for the characters, like when someone is arguing about an accident. I cannot scream because there is my neighbors near me. So I'm doing it differently, and it's a bit weird to see. The acting is a bit weird because there is a strange dynamic. It's really the contextualized way to see it, and trying to reformulate it in a 3D model will be this idea of a weird thing between a public space and an intimate space. Because it's not a carrefour, but it's a theater place, so it's even more intimate.
It reminds me, when I was still studying, I was working sometimes with autist children. Some of them were not fully autists, but we called them half autists, a different intensity somehow. Obviously, there's a strong physical and even mental distance implied by their way of living and interacting. But they still wanted sometimes body intimacy or at least proximity. If so, they would not use the usual codes that we have if we want to initiate physical proximity. So what they would do is that they would go close to you and, for instance, lean against your leg, half from the back and looking in another direction. So you would suddenly feel another body against your leg with no other sign of what we would properly call interaction. However, bringing two physical surfaces of bodies together, and I think, well, I don't exactly know why I'm telling this now, but I think somehow this autist gesture, it might be quite related to this position of sitting between intimacy and public that we are talking about.
Yes, and something interesting about what you say with the children is, I think, when they do that, it's also seeing you as an object of a human, not as a human, more as an object that signifies interaction. It is also the way I see all the performing people in a way. It's a bit weird to say. But the policemen performers, it's more about an object of authority doing circulation than a real character. It's more seeing them as a function.
And the idea of abusing those inside views that are provided by people and that you can put into the model, sort of handled as object frames in a software device. In this idea, there is something quite close to the primary moment, no? Another strong aspect is about the question, what is missing? The observation protocol is obviously, there's evidently more what is not told than what is actually told. And I guess that there's a certain haptic relation between those apparent gaps in relation to the idea of object frames that are separated and handled in this sort of extremely fragmented way.
Yes, and this time I was really thinking about the functionment of the carrefour. So seeing the policeman as part of this function. So the idea was, how does it work? But now, with all the time passed before the reenacting, it's more how to make it functional. It's not just what did I miss, but more about how do I transform what I saw. Not even for me, because the most important thing in this work is the collectivity. Because the people who are working with me are actually doing 80% of the work. They found the ideas, they found the aesthetic, and they know more than me about how to realize these things. This 3D view is also a way to see how they are working with the things that I give them, like the performance, by themselves. And so, how do they interpret all the things and do something really close to them? Because they are in the context of being at home. So it's really different than in a theater situation. And I really like this way that it gives to a reinterpretation.
I think it's a kind of double translation, no? Because what you observe in the carrefour itself, it's not at all about reconstruction in order to do it as precise as possible. While at the same time it shares a projection about getting as close as possible towards the situation that you were observing first. Then, how to invent that space, because reconstruction of space will happen obviously as invention, as fiction. Nothing fits the original situation, and this is not the perspective. The opposite. Rather, it's about a translation that makes it impossible to access the primary situation. It's entirely fictional. And it is only insofar about memorizing as memorizing is a specific way of forgetting, right? Let's think about that in two-step process. You are observing the context, you are tracing the context into a document, and the document becomes a starting point for a reconstruction of people who have actually never been at this place. What they do again is not again, obviously. It has nothing to do with this situation. And on the other hand, of course, it is strongly linked with it in a certain sense. So it is not random, and it is random. It constructs something meaningful, we suppose, sort of pointing to the object itself and to the methodology of translating it into that online stream.
Yes, sure. And all the game of the project is to see how to have the attitude, believing that we are going to do the same thing. Because nobody was there except me, and even when I was there, I was not really able to see what happened. So the only thing that we can do is to try to play as we are trying, to do the same thing. But in doing that, it's obviously taking us in another place and in another situation, and it's building things differently. That is no longer a Carrefour in Tirana.
Yes, there's a need to believe or to imagine this motivation to get as close as possible to a point. And at the same time, obviously, all the game is fictionalization on multiple levels. It is linked for me to the primary motivation of bringing students to Tirana. My own experience that I have had during this biennale that I did there years ago. In fact, the experience of being in a context that is over-complex, like any context in fact, but in a certain way a paradigmatic case of such foreigners. It was centrally to share that experience of an impossibility, to take a position or to talk or act or even observe from this position. There's no right to do. There's no value of authenticity in a sense. There's no position you can take because you are principally foreign to the context. Well, that is something that you can actually say about any kind of situation. But for me, in the context of Albania, for some reason, there was something particularly evident about this general fact, you know. Your reenactment is for me also a transcription of this fact into some perspective like, yes, because I can take no position and because I cannot talk and because I cannot act, this is precisely what gives me in turn the ability and the right to talk, to act, and to take a position. Namely, the fact that it's impossible makes it possible, somehow.
Yes, and that is, I think, one of the most important points of this project.
I think since the beginning in Brussels, obviously, taking one's own heartbeat as a time measure for the traffic light, at the end you can ask yourself whether it's talking more about traffic lights or rather about your heart and its possible cardiac diseases. I guess this in between the body and the context is something really important in a context like Albania. As we said before, not at least because of the lack of communication as a foreigner within this particular singular language and the very, very different practice of interaction that you are facing. After developing some of the tools for Belgium, for Brussels, I think to displace and to inject them into the context of Tirana, I think gives a different and particularly strong meaning, actually.
Yes, I found it interesting. As you said, when you explained the different goals of this trip, to literally take the practices and the codes I had built in Brussels and to implement them into this new context without changing anything. This made me see what was still working in this project, what was not, and what was surprisingly working better, like the traffic lights measurement. And in a second step, of course, to modify my protocol to adapt it to the new difficulties, the new shape. But this idea of confrontation itself is very important because it's also clarifying a certain position I have in this new context. I affirm a certain distanciation with the world around me, and this distanciation gives me space to experiment and to live inside this new context that is violently new.
There were different ways to understand this point of the displacement of one's practice, which for me is one of the most central methods if I would try to describe my approach to a teaching learning environment. This idea of literal territorial displacement, to take your process and to invest it within a different spatial context, it is one of the tools that we regularly use. It is as important for the collaborators who joined the department over time, Pampon for example. One could say that it is basically kind of crystallizing what we try to develop in the school.
Yes, and by the way, this change is really, you can really feel the difference between the two. For example, the measuring the rhythm of the traffic lights with the heartbeats was clearly a Brussels thing. I didn't follow it in Albania because it was so evident how the traffic lights were working that I knew that I could understand how it was working. In Brussels, it was more a performative way to make appear that I couldn't understand that what was happening in the Carrefour. Here it was a big shift because I knew that I could end the game actually, to really turn around the Carrefour, and that's what happened because I counted with the fixed value. Yes, and it was so much more complex in Brussels, maybe too complex. So I felt like nobody will be able to help me to understand. I had no knowledge to understand that in Brussels. In Tirana, it was much simple and evident. It was almost written on the Carrefour how it was working. I just had to observe.
Or as said, the complexity happened on different levels or was different within different frameworks. Like when you integrate the policemen in the calculation and they're taking over of the traffic situation by a proper human interaction at one point. And also it's true that because I remember the first time that I was in Albania, you could not at all rely on the reaction of people to traffic lights in any case, even if you wouldn't have policemen around. It would not mean that people necessarily would stop if there's a red traffic light. The last times I was there, I felt this danger less strong, somehow more like we are used to. But before it was really very dangerous.
I'm really interested to go back there in 10 years to see how it changed and try to redo the game. I think it could be a beautiful way to rework on this project after this year.
I agree, especially as you define so rigidly one specific frame. I think it could lead you to a lot of precise observations of transformation.
It is also because it's interesting to see it as a research, a form of scientific research. To be able now with the reenactment, because it's also the point of the reenactment to understand where I was not good at, what I didn't see, what I missed, and how my position itself was not really precise. And to find a way to precise it in the future also. That's also why the reenactment is important here. It's to simulate the same thing, to understand how to put my body in another position, to be able to observe more precisely the situation.
It is a bit out of the frame of this sort of reenactment of talk, but I think it could be interesting to discuss this point. I'm curious what you're thinking about when you say that you were not precise in certain ways in your position. I say this because the imprecision of your position is a part of the game in a certain way, no? If I think about the sort of randomness, for example, of how observation notes appear on the timeline, I mean, there's actually more holes than content at the end.
I was more speaking about the fact that the things I wrote are sometimes surprising. It seems I was not really sure of what to see, and so I put a lot of notes in my script that are really quite related to the observation I wanted to have about the comparison of the Carrefour. Why did I write this? But it's really interesting to see why and to try to understand what I was trying to say with these observations. That's what I'm telling with the imprecision of the observation. It's just that I'm not quite sure of the position I had there. I had no clear position and I need to see what was this unclear position.
I mean, defining a precise position, it's also, of course, always a kind of narrative that we put on something afterwards. We sort of rethink ourselves into a situation and we construct the frame that makes sense and a narrative as an architecture of the situation. As this kind of memory work actually starts right away when one moment passes, and thus as memory is part of what we perceive as the perception itself already, it is a question whether we can possibly think about such clear position in the present tense, or whether that's always something that is coming after, in a sort of post-production of what we call a situation somehow. But so, okay, yes, I'm not sure what else we spoke in the Skype.
Well, I think we just ended the discussion with some goodbyes and good work. But before, I would have a question.
Yeah?
I don't think we spoke about it during the Skype we had at the time, but I would be interested to hear a bit more about the reasons why you brought students different times in Albania, specifically.
Well, as mentioned before, for me, it is based on two aspects. One is my own experience in Albania that started with my invitation to realize a project for the Biennale around 2007, I think. Of course, Albania has a very particular position concerning a mental consciousness or unconsciousness of us Europeans, or more generally, Albania outsiders, which is more or less a form of absence or even inexistence, I would say. It might have changed a bit since, but this was still relatively close to the early constitution of the new Albanian state. Okay, it already started in the early 90s, but then there was the big economical crisis in Albania, the pirate funds, etc. And so the only fragments and images that would have been in my mind, and I think that this might have been rather representative ignorance, were few of those riot pics from the news of the mid-90s. Otherwise, there's really a black hole that follows this period of enormous isolation during the Hoxha dictatorship. We talk here about an almost complete disconnection of Albania from an outside world, even the communist outside world. This absence of an outside view led to the situation that Albania was this country that doesn't exist. Later, this became one subject of my own process there, but in the beginning it was just this lack of images. And in fact, of course, I entered the situation very much with my own practice in the background, that already gave very central attention to a relation between the subject and the context somehow. Through the process of memory reconstruction by drawing, you can, of course, always question what is your relation to this world somehow that materializes as a trace between an outside and the subjectivity of perceiving, of remembering and forgetting. Does this point to the subject or to the outside? Well, I guess it points to both somehow. But this position obviously is highly questionable, and it's always contaminated by strong ethical questions, like the one, what position can you take there to observe and to reconstruct? As we discussed before, such ethics of observation, of recording, of taking place actually, while they are on the table wherever you research, here they seem to gain a particular evidence in my view, or rather in my experience. A strong experience of not knowing how to find a position to act, to talk, or to even perceive in a certain sense. So this is one part of the answer, and on the other side there's this aspect of teaching, learning, which is fundamental on the idea of displacement that I was explaining before.
Yes, okay. I really share this thing to take this experience of not knowing as a gesture and as a discourse in itself that you can appropriate. Well, thank you very much for the talk, and I hope we will be able to meet again soon, even if now we are all a bit in a not knowing position.
Yes, for sure. I'm excited to hear more about your process, and especially the fiature of the policeman that you made after that. Have a good time in Tirana.
Thank you. Yes, I'll keep in touch with you for the next steps. I hope to see you soon.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye.